Hey, it's Rob, aka the Orphic Creative, and welcome to Retro Production Episode 3. In the previous 2 episodes, we took a look at some old electronic keyboards from the 1980s. But of course, there's been a market for toy instruments for a lot longer than that. So today, let's delve back even further into history and take a look at an example of one of those. And then we'll give it the normal retro production treatment and try and see just how far we can push it with the aid of today's modern sequencing and production technology. Spoiler alert, I think you might be surprised. Let's get into it.
When I was about 10 or 11, my mum discovered an old toy instrument that she'd had as a child and passed it on to me. I was immediately captivated by its sound. I've always been attracted to Eastern sounding music, and this little toy had a definite air of Asian mysticism to it. Or at least it did to my 11-year-old self. I made a lot of music with it, and some of it still survives on tapes that I recorded at the time, like this example. The toy is called a charm harp. It's a small stringed instrument of a type often referred to as a zither or lap harp, although there are many variations with different shapes and features. The commonality they all share is a set of strings stretched across a resonating box, and they're normally played using a pick. That original toy is long gone now, but I managed to find an almost identical one on eBay. They were made by a company called FMT in Japan. I haven't been able to find much information about them, but they appear to have manufactured a range of toy musical instruments in the 1950s and 60s. I'd guess that this one is a slightly later model, since it has a more modern-looking label, but the design is otherwise identical to the one that I had as a kid. The build quality is pretty rough, not really what we'd expect from Japan today. But of course, at this point in history, Japan was still in the early stages of its economic transformation. It was accelerating rapidly though, and only a decade or so later, they'd be producing world-leading electronics and technology. And that's what I like about this little harp. It's a snapshot into a very specific point in history, a time when seismic changes were occurring in the Far East. It still has the essence of a traditional handmade Eastern instrument, but mass-manufactured for a Western audience. And that's, I think, exactly what gives this charm harp its charm. The design is very simple. The metal strings are attached to pegs on the left, and then stretched over a metal bridge and attached to adjustable nuts on the right. By turning the bolts on the end, the nuts move up and down the threads and change the tension on the strings. They've included 2 plastic picks, which can be held in each hand and used to pluck the strings. You can also pluck them with your fingers, which produces a softer and more mellow sound. As a kid though, I discovered almost by accident that you can get a completely different sound out of the instrument if you hit the strings with beaters. I originally used pencils since they were the most suitable objects I had at my disposal. But I think I can make something a little better than that now, with some dowel rods. The main advantage of these is you can play notes much quicker than you can with the picks. And you can also bounce the beaters off the strings, giving a really nice repeating note effect. It sounds very much like a hammered dulcimer or a Persian santur. I love how this sounds. It definitely gives the instrument a much more exotic vibe. And it's a surprisingly pure and beautiful tone from such a cheap little toy instrument. So let's mic it up and see what we can make with it. You've actually already heard it in the intro track. It really does sound surprisingly lush, with just a few extra effects added. But let's see if we can push it a bit further now, with some more advanced studio magic. Of course, the most obvious thing to do next is sample it. I'm going to record 2 tracks simultaneously. One is a stereo track with the mics placed on either side of the instrument, and for the other I'm going to use this mono lapel mic and place it right into the body. This should get a nice warm tone, which we can mix with the stereo tracks to adjust the richness of the final instrument. Now I'm going to record tapping each string individually, allowing it to resonate fully until it dies away. Unfortunately, I don't have the luxury of recording in a proper studio at the moment, so background noise is a bit of an issue.
King dog.
This definitely takes some patience. The final recordings do have some hiss and ambient noise, so first I'm going to run them through a denoiser to get rid of the worst of it. Now, let's create an instrument in Ableton. Since we have 2 separate recordings, one from the stereo mics and one from the body, we need to have 2 sampler instruments layered up in an instrument rack. For each of these, I need to map the recording of each individual string to the correct notes. This is pretty tedious work. But now that we have them mapped, we can start shaping the final sound. The stereo mics did a good job of capturing the transients when I hit the strings, but they also have more ambient noise. The sound from the lapel mic is much cleaner, and it captures the warmth of the body, but less of the transients. So let's set the filtering and envelope of the stereo sample to play just the transient, and then fade away, while the body sample will remain sustained, but it will be low pass filtered to keep it clean. So our combined instrument will now have a nice crisp stereo attack, but a warm and clean decay with no noticeable noise. To give the instrument a bit more realism, I'll adjust the volume and filtering to vary slightly with the velocity, so that harder notes are brighter and slightly louder than softer ones. One limitation with the original Harp is that all notes are sustained all the time. This means that faster passages can get a bit muddy. So in this sampled instrument, I'm going to map the release time to a macro, and then use the expression control tool to set that to the mod wheel. This means I can now adjust the decay dynamically while playing to keep things sounding tidier. There we go, that sounds pretty amazing. I think that's retained most of the character of the original Harp, but it's much easier to play now. I'm going to repeat the process now, but with plucking the strings instead of hitting them with beaters. So there goes another few hours. This has also turned out really nicely. It's got a different character to the hammered instrument. It sounds more folky and arguably more authentically Asian. One of the other things I want to capture is the rolling sound made by bouncing the beaters on the strings. So let's record a roll on each string and then map this into a sampler. Now I'll set up a loop for each note and try and make it sound as seamless as possible. This is alright so far, but it loses its realism when the note is released. What we need is for the string to decay away naturally at the end. To do this, we'll need a separate sample layer which is triggered by note off commands. So let's add an additional instrument rack and insert the note length MIDI tool, which has an option to set the trigger to note off. Now we can add an additional sampler instrument where each sample starts at the end of the roll, where the string is left to decay away. This will then play when the key is released. There, that sounds much better. But what would be even cooler is if we could switch between the single and repeated notes on the fly. So let's set up yet another instrument rack, and in here we'll put our single and repeated note samplers. In the Chain Select tab, we can set an individual range for each instrument, and then we can map this to a macro. What this essentially means is when the control is at the top, the rolled note will sound, and when it's at the bottom, the single one will. The final step is to map this to a physical control on my keyboard. When I press the button, the note is rolled, and when I release it, it goes back to single. Wow, how cool does that sound? That's pretty close to the real instrument now. I'm very happy with that. So I feel like I've successfully captured the essence of the instrument in sample form. But can we go even further? Can we possibly make an entire track using just sounds from this instrument? Definitely quite a challenge, but let's give it a go. Alright, so I've been working on this over the last couple of days, and I have to say, I'm pretty jazzed with how it's turned out. I really was not expecting it to hit as hard as this. So let's take a look at some of the layers, and then I will play you the final track. So all the sounds we've collected so far from this instrument are very bright, with a sharp attack. But what happens if we lengthen the attack to make a softer type sound? That sounds pretty awesome, kind of like a violin. And now let's add some effects to that. The Portal plugin for some delay, and some reverb. Oh yeah, proper dreamy. Definitely a completely different character to the original. Now, how about a bass sound? The lowest actual note on the harp is A below middle C. So definitely not into bass territory. But of course we can pitch the sample down. The trouble with this though is that the minor pitch variations in the note become more pronounced as the pitch is lowered. So to stabilize it, let's rather isolate a single wavelength and then loop it. This gives us some of the character of the sound, but without the pitch issues. This is fine for a sub-bass, but we need more attack on that. So let's add another layer with the hammered sample, and then pitch it down an octave. Then we can set a quick decay envelope so that we just retain the initial strike. Now that sounds really cool, a bit like a slap bass, nice and punchy. Okay, next we need a short stabby type sound, the sort of sound we would use in an arpeggiator. Let's start with the hammered sample since it has the most attack. If we shorten the volume and filter decay right down, this gives us a nice start. But it sounds a little thin, so to fill it out a bit more, let's reuse the sub-bass waveform we created earlier and add it as another layer, pitched down an octave. Now that sounds much meatier. For the B section, we need a different type of patch. Let's start with a plucked sample, but try to switch it up a notch. This should sound pretty good with some distortion. So first I'll add a compressor to bring out the maximum information in the sound, and then we can add the overdrive distortion with some reverb. Pretty cool, right? Sounds quite similar to a distorted lead guitar. Now let's make this a little more interesting in the track by adding some glitchy type effects to it. For this, I'll use my trusty old Chaos pad. I'll record a couple of takes where I'm adding in some random loopy type glitching. Then I'll pick the best of these takes to use in the track. So far, we've only made pitched instruments, but what about rhythm? The body of the harp has some quite nice resonance, so let's record bumping it and import that into a drum rack. Now we can use some resonant filtering to give it a bit more punch. A bit of EQ on that, and now we have a pretty great sounding kick. For a snare, we can try and generate some noise. If I lay this metal cover on the strings and hit it, that gives us something we can use. Now we just need to add some enveloping and EQ. I'm also going to copy that and pitch it down an octave with a bit of reverb to add some extra presence. I'll use a similar hit sound for the hi-hat. For this, we can set a short decay envelope and then just add some EQ to isolate the high frequencies. We also need an open hat or ride type sound. I'll start with the same sample but loop it. And then we can add some reverb with the stereo width set to 0, which will simulate the sizzle of an open cymbal. Right, so we have a good set of instruments and drums now. But let's now make a few effects to use throughout the track. Let's start with a riser. If I drag this metal cover over the strings, we get a pretty cool slide type sound with some nice pitch variations in it. Let's warp that now to double the length and then add some EQ and distortion to bring out some of those cool pitched elements. Then let's finish it off with some echo. Nice. For the breakdown section, let's add an ambient type effect. We can use another one of those slide samples, but this time add a grain delay to break it up into tiny pieces. Some EQ on that to tidy it up a bit. And I think that will do just fine. Here's a couple more bits of ear candy. We have this strike sound I made by hitting the beaters together, with a huge long reverb tail added. And here's a dive type effect, which is just the sub-bass sound we made earlier, with a pitch envelope added. And finally, here's a little fill sound, which again is the same body hit sound that we used to make the kick, but this time with filtering and a short decay envelope to make it sound more like a tom. Alright, so time to reveal the final track. I have to say, this has really surprised me. I was not expecting to end up with something as full sounding as this, from just a humble little toy harp. Remember, everything you're about to hear started as a sound made by this instrument. It just goes to show you can make music with just about anything you have at your disposal. All it takes is some time, creativity, and patience. Enjoy. And if you've made it this far, then hopefully I've earned a subscription from you. I'll see you on the next one.